Hi, I'm Sebastien Couture of the Epicenter podcast. I'm here in Basel, Switzerland for the very first edition of the Hyperledger Global Forum. It was a 4-day event organized by the Linux Foundation that gathered over 700 participants, from startups to developers and enterprise, all building applications on the technologies in the Hyperledger greenhouse. So while I was at the event, I had the opportunity to speak with community members, learn about what they're building, and how they're contributing to the tools and technologies in the Hyperledger family. So here's my conversation with Doug Johnson Poensgen, founder and CEO of Circulor.
I am Doug Johnson Poensgen. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Circulor. Circular's mission is raw materials traceability for the electronics and electric vehicle markets, and we focus particularly on cobalt and tantalum, which are minerals that large proportions of which come out of Central Africa and come with a whole selection of human rights abuses and other concerns which both regulators and consumers care about. Let me tell you a little bit about the supply chains that we're trying to focus on. So the first thing to say is that raw materials supply chains are global and they're complicated. So the material that comes out of the ground, so in the case of cobalt, mined as earth, will then go to a refinery. From a refinery it may go to a cathode manufacturer. From there it might go to a battery cell manufacturer. From there it gets put into battery packs and ends up in an electric vehicle. That's not only global but also quite complicated. And unlike other traceability problems, so there are a number of examples of food, farm to fork type traceability problems. Clearly the material that comes out of the ground is nothing like the material that gets put in a car. Or if you're looking at another material that we're focused on, tantalum, which is used in capacitors, your phone has probably got about 700 capacitors in it, of which maybe half would contain tantalum, which is a conflict mineral mined in Africa. The material comes out of the ground as earth and ends up in capacitors in your iPhone. And so how do you maintain a chain of custody demonstrating that the material going into an industrial process and coming out of an industrial process is the same multiple times over? I would argue that this is a near classic use case for a distributed ledger. Why? Because at every step of the supply chain from mine to manufacturer, you have many participants dealing with many participants dealing with many participants. There is no central authority. Although there are international regulations, the OECD, for example, publishes a set of guidelines for raw materials traceability. In the US, companies that are listed on the US Stock Exchange have to report annually to the Securities and Exchange Commission about the source of their raw materials. There are similar rules coming into effect in the EU. There's no central authority which could host a big database that people would then all use and subscribe to. So it lends itself naturally to a distributed ledger, which, and a technology like blockchain, of course, can bring trust in, between otherwise semi or untrusted participants. And that's why it's a near classic use case for a blockchain. Our production platform is built on Hyperledger Fabric, and we're also contributing to Hyperledger Quilt. I'll talk about Fabric first. Hyperledger Fabric has built, I think, quite a good reputation as an enterprise class, non-industry specific blockchain platform. We looked at others like, for example, Corda, which is of course very much associated with financial services, particularly trading, and concluded that it didn't necessarily have the same features that we felt we needed to be able to make a system like ours work, and particularly taken, for example, by the ability to create privacy and the consensus mechanisms in Fabric, which we thought were appropriate to the sort of supply chains that we were looking at. The reason why we're contributing to Hyperledger Quilt, and for those of you who don't know, Quilt is one of the Hyperledger projects looking at interoperability of blockchains. The reason why we're contributing to that is because my view is that in 5 to 8 years' time there'll be a plethora of different blockchains tracking raw materials, and if you're Apple or BMW, you don't want to subscribe to 300 different blockchain type solutions in an attempt to somehow work out where all your raw materials come from. You'll want to go to someone who can potentially integrate all that data and provide you with a complete picture of raw materials traceability for those things that you're interested in. And so for me, owning that customer layer in the medium term will rely on something like Quilt. The reason we picked Hyperledger Fabric as our technology platform was because We like the idea of open source. Open source, of course, is the fastest, in my view, the fastest way to develop a new technology, because you're, of course, drawing on the brains of multiple organizations who are contributing to those projects. We created our first proof of concept in Ethereum because it was quick and easy to do, and we could find people who could code in Ethereum. We then did a second proof of concept trying to use Hyperledger Sawtooth, and concluded that arguably Fabric would be better. And we also felt that because the end clients that we were eventually going to want to serve were the likes of large car manufacturers or consumer electronics companies, they would recognize the collaboration of a combination of both innovative startups and large global technology companies in developing a blockchain platform as an important credential for them to decide that our solution might be right. There are, of course, a plethora of different blockchain technologies. I'm sure there's some extraordinarily clever stuff going on in a whole variety of them. Eventually, that will trickle through into Hyperledger Fabric, and already Hyperledger Fabric is going through that evolution. So we found getting involved with Hyperledger as a foundation really helpful to us. We formally joined, even though we were using the code beforehand, we formally joined this summer. And I found that the Hyperledger team has actively sought to engage us with not only partner organizations in the sort of the startup ecosystem that could potentially be relevant to us, but also actively promoted us to corporates who approach them asking for whom they might engage with, for example, in their supply chain. So I've had, I think, 3 or 4 conversations with prospective clients that have come as direct introductions from Hyperledger, and at the moment they're in the process of introducing us to VCs as well. I'm most excited for the future of Hyperledger because of the certification of both the technology, its use cases, and the certification of developers. Because what that does is start to bring this into the mainstream of the sort of the panoply of qualifications that developers will seek in an effort to improve their employability and utility. And for me, that's the point at which an early stage technology starts to mature, and those people will end up, some of them in startups, but some of them in very large corporates who are my potential clients. And of course, with them, they bring a body of knowledge which over time demystifies blockchain in the minds of organizations who might be my customers. So I think that's really exciting.